naive opt-out workflow on that trusted site, then you're going to be saying, then you're going to be denying your information to that one site. You're not going to be denying your information to all the third parties that are doing things that are probably more the cause of your privacy concerns. So what we want to do is make opt-out decisions effective and reflect the user's actual preferences.
So the browser already has to block 90%, and then you're going to throw up something that says, hey, you want to get the next 10% too? Is that right?
The browser has a lot of what happens in the browser blocked. But we know from research users don't just run one browser. Users don't just run one device. If we starve a particular site browser combination of information, then that surveillance effort just gets squeezed out somewhere else.
So if I'm understanding, you're talking about doing something immediately now and not for the future? Is that the idea?
We're talking about getting the privacy town, if you want to call it that, project launched as soon as we get a local publisher and a local community picked out. And we're talking about getting the opt-out workflow set up in time for a working launch when CCPA goes into effect in 2020.
Or the LMC sharing? Or something else? I'm sorry, I really have a lot of trouble following what you're talking about. But did I just answer that narrow question? Like, am I opting out of the LMC data exchange, or are you talking about something else entirely?
No, we're talking. Okay, we're talking about an opt-out. We're talking about an opt-out portal. We're talking about an opt-out portal that would collect the opt-out information from every third party that's relevant to that user and sending opt-outs to all those third parties. So whether it's Axiom or whoever, right? We're talking about massively amplifying opt-outs so that your eyeballs are not out there on the generic market. Yeah.
Group was about the how do I decide to engage in the LMC experience, but okay.
Yeah. I don't want to.
Thank you.
Anytime a user says I want to opt out, we don't want to take that opt out as meaning, oh, this user hates us. We want to take that opt out as meaning, oh, this user's concerned about tracking. Let's spam everyone who would possibly track them with their opt out.
So is the idea to give transparency to the user too about all the stuff that's actually being shared?
Yes, users are concerned about users are
position.
concerned about this stuff, but most users don't even know who Axiom is.
Right.
Thank you.
Good job.
All right, so questions.
Not that it's immediate or will happen without a lot of feedback anyway, but for journalism to say there's going to be a private, just the interplay between journalism and privacy is really complicated, considering that reporting is often invasive of privacy, and to tag that in when you're talking about a whole privacy city, that it won't impinge on reporting, because that can get confusing to an ordinary person, that you're then not allowing reporters to invade privacy.
No, like once the conversation moves, I'll go into the next.
Okay, do we still have more comments?
No, I was going to.
Oh, Bill, do you want to do the next?
Want to do the next one? Okay.
So, yep. So we had,
Wait, Bill,
Yep.
Fran wants to ask.
oh yeah, Todd Eskelson, Aviva Obadiah, Amy Stepanovian. I just butchered your last name. Chris Lewis, Joe Harden, and Fran Wills, and me. So our task was to talk a little bit about what does this thing look like from a governance point of view. We talked about what already exists, which is a fairly plain vanilla 501c3 that's incorporated in California with a very thin setup of a small board and the option for adding bells and whistles as time goes on. And because Todd, he's out of the room right now, but because he joined us and has experience with the Bluetooth SIG and a lot of experience with starting up organizations, we kind of looked to him for some guidance. And he thought the first thing was to define our constituencies and figure out what their interests are, and then based on that, figure out how you want to configure the board representation, because it could be that different constituencies might have different classes of membership or have different rights of election to the board. And also figure out how they might be participating in the governance or operating of the operation in other ways. We talked about then, once you've got that laid down, how you deal with strategic issues, whether you have an advisory board to the governing board, whether you have a series of working groups or task groups, and so forth. We talked a little bit about, well, then another key question is what's the revenue, what's the sustainability process? Our current thinking is that our early stage sustainability is foundation and corporate support. But we want to transition to a system where there's some kind of tax-like function that on transactions within the network that fund it. But that also, I think Amy raised a really good question about that, and that was, would that create an incentive for ITEGA or a downstream corporation of ITEGA to be pushing for more and more and more and more identity usage, or more and more transactions, because that's how revenue stream stays up. So then we talked a little bit, well, how do you mitigate that? And that's an open question. One possibility is that a due structure gets set once a year, and it's not directly tied to the volume on the system, but rather to other factors or additional factors. We talked a little bit about how to avoid, again, both Amy and I have had a little experience with the NSTIC process, where the unit of the Commerce Department tried to get an identity infrastructure going for the federal government, and it didn't work very well. And we talked about why that didn't work, which was in part because you were sort of being forced to choose between the government controlling identity or a bunch of private tech vendors creating identity standards, and that didn't work for any constituency very well. And so what's unique about what we're doing here is we're talking about using neither a private corporation like Google or Facebook, nor a government, a nation state, to manage the identity stuff. So we talked a little bit about also how to make sure that the process of setting up an identity infrastructure was not governed entirely by the need to service fixing the ad ecosystem, because there are other reasons why we want to have persistent or reliable identity across the web. And then in terms of specific strategic issues to deal with once the sort of governance, the high-level governance issues that I've talked about are handled, is we need to have a privacy policy in place, and we need to have a member agreement in place, or a set of member agreements in place. So that's sort of as far as we got. We didn't decide on a next step. We didn't get that far, but I think a next step is probably to have some further phone meetings or otherwise with interested parties. Questions?
Bill, did you get into privacy policy at all, or the privacy
No,
values?
we assumed that there was another group working on that. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Amy, did I do okay? Oh, thank you. I asked her to back me up.
Great, thanks, Bill. All right, Brendan?
I'm just gonna get my hair out of the way here.
Can I just confirm who's in the group? So I have Rick, Mark, Justin, Gary, Chris, Brendan, Laura, Arvid, Mitch, and Joe Ellen. Oh, Chris Kell.
Did anyone else get missed?
Were there two Chris's?
No, it's Mike.
Okay, so do you get Gary? Yeah. But Dave's not here, man. So we hit like the first, and riffing on some of what Don was talking about incidentally, we did talk about the scope of the audience that we were discussing initially, and really did talk about that set of users who are willing to get identified, and also are using privacy tools. So as you're talking about increasing the use of privacy tools, that obviously increases the scope. But that conversation did lead us to a discussion about different types of identification. So up here you've got like identified versus verified versus authenticated. Which leads us to one of our follow-up actions, which is to understand the use cases, document and understand the use cases in a regulatory environment around consent and through other scenarios for those three different types of identification. The real high level is identified is, hey, you gave us some value and we're trusting it just plainly. Verified is like you gave us an email, we emailed there and you clicked on a link. And authenticated is that there's a username and password or equivalent. So, you know, obviously some questions on the infrastructure level about motivating that. And really, when it comes down to publisher adoption of this type of infrastructure, the point of that not being free, like it is not free for publishers to adopt technology, was a point well made and well heard. We did hear from LMC talking about how they're working currently to reduce costs by pooling and having positive agreements, and how there's interest in supporting cost-effective implementations of technologies for members as a way of reducing the implementation cost. And then we did have some policy governance questions like, you know, the integration of third-party data that we just said, well, we're not going to touch that, just say, hey, it would be feasible at this point from a technology perspective, but that type of decision really should be made outside of our specific group. As to specific actions, so up here, if you're in here, we've got some data flows of data flow diagrams that are really roughed out of how the user flow would look like when they're interacting with different sites and going through in both an authenticated and verified context. And our action items really are first to document the difference in use cases around identified, verified, and authenticated user identities. Then to firm up these data flow diagrams and attach the use cases to them. And then to go through with a different colored pen and to highlight what components should be owned by ITAGA, which ones should be verified or certified by ITAGA, and to start offering suggestions as to the type of technology that exists that could be used for those particular ones.
Great, terrific. Questions, comments, next steps? Did you say next steps?
I hit 3.
You had 3. Sorry, I'm like, my brain's not working.
No, I wrote them down, so my brain didn't have to work. I just kind of read from the teleprompter.
Questions, comments? Sounds good. All right, fourth group, privacy.
Thank you very much.
Okay, privacy policy group was Joe, Kevin, Michelle, Chris. Anybody else?
Johannes was in ours too, right? Okay, so
It was an interesting discussion because, we as privacy advocates spend a lot of time thinking and criticizing privacy policies, but to think of, well, what would we want in one, and what's realistic was a good conversation to have. So there are a couple things that we, don't have enough information on yet to be able to address. For example, what attributes are the minimum for an advertiser? Right, we don't really know what those are. We don't know what the authenticating attribute will be, whether it's email or something like that. So we asked questions like, in general, what do we want people to consent to? What are we asking them to consent to? The policy has to answer that, right? Joining the consortium, joining the ecosystem, giving information for authentication, do we include things like location tracking? Right, those kinds of things I think we need to have more understanding of what is going to happen with the advertisers and that. And frankly, I think location in this context, if we have a closed data ecosystem, could make sense, right? I mean, if you're wanting to target and you already have a newspaper that's very clearly in one location, there could be a way to do that. We talked about having limits on service providers, so saying to service providers that are a part of this ecosystem that you cannot take this data and have a secondary use, right? You just can't. There may be some analytics that come on the site to help with that, but they cannot take the data. Nobody can take the data is sort of the default. I know. We also talked about what the value is to users in this scenario. So some of the messaging that might come around that and what might end up in the privacy policy, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. We want you to have access to all these different properties, but we also are trying to keep, Facebook and Google or this ecosystem away, give you a safe and private experience, trying to save journalism, that kind of thing. We talked about what shouldn't be an attribute. In other words, there's attributes that we're going to collect and potentially use. What is not allowed? And that's when we had another conversation and realized that location could work maybe if we tiered it. So instead of precise geolocation, maybe that's off the table. You don't need to know what someone's address is, but you may want to know the city level data. And we also talked about health, but didn't really come to a consensus about that, health data. So that's something we'll have to address. How ITEGA vets the vendors in the system will matter a lot, is how the publishers vet any vendors like web analytics companies or something in their system will have to be addressed in the policy. Breach notification we thought of, actually Joe thought of, and making that really quick. And to be progressive, to have a good privacy policy, it needs to be within 72 hours, that's the GDPR. And the way and how and when that happens for people, right? What is a breach? What constitutes that? How long to keep the user data is another big question. I don't know the answer to, which I believe the publishers probably all have different varying lengths. So we're going to really limit that. I don't think, unless I'm not thinking of it and later we realize there needs to be more time with the data. Usually you really don't need it for very long. So depending on the type of data, you might need some to be persistent for authentication or whatever, but you probably don't necessarily need it all. So we're talking about having strict limitations on that. Also, something someone brought up that I thought was really good was a complaint, the issue of complaints. I know this sounds minor, but if you think about whenever you've had a problem with something, Joe was talking about having problems with some apps, and you don't have anywhere to go, right? There's nowhere to complain to or to say, hey, someone is tracking me, or I'm not able to work this, or whatever. So just making sure that a privacy policy is for real people, not just regulators. So that would include some way to have a complaint. Maybe asking the publishers to designate a DPO even, right? Maybe that's a way to do this. The ability to revoke consent at any time. One question that we also had is how social widgets might be used. You could see them being where they can't collect anything. There's restrictions on that, but users might want to post something. Is that okay, right? I think generally that could be okay, but what are the restrictions that we would have to apply to that for the platforms? And this also applies to like video content, right? That might get pulled in. How is that going to function in this ecosystem? What are the rules around that? And I think that's basically it. Did I miss anything? No? Okay. So these are the bones of this policy that we'll flesh out. And that's our focus, is going to be fleshing out the bones and presenting recommendations to the group.
I actually had a question, comment. I don't know about the advertising economy, but in the membership economy, you need to have data about individuals persist over a long period of time.
Really?
Yeah, because the thing is, if somebody is a member or a potential member, you want to know what they did 3 or 4 years ago because they expect you to remember that about them. So, for example, if you're a maternity magazine and they've had 2 children already, and they went through the birth and all that, then when the time comes for their 3rd child, they don't want you to serve them stuff about, this is your 1st child. They actually want you to remember.
I mean, a way we could handle that would be like account. We talked about this a little bit, but if there is a registration or an account, we could tier it by, like an account profile.
Like a profile,
like
yeah.
Then maybe profiles, the data is kept longer for various reasons with permission, whereas the other types of data aren't.
Yeah, I'm saying the first party data might need to be, anyway.
So just learning from the privacy debates we've been having around privacy legislation, we've been asking folks in the legislative context to respect existing regimes for privacy that already work. And so I'm curious, one, about the mention of health data, because there is a regime that works and it's one that can just be modeled and followed.
Are you talking about HIPAA?
Yeah. But two, we also have in the principles that we talked about the idea of data minimization, and it's not clear to me why health information is even on the table here as something that this sort of exchange would want to track. So, thinking about that as a specific example for broader data minimization conversations, I think is really important, because whether it's health information, banking information, location information, you could go down the list of things that people like to label as sensitive, and what that means for compliance with existing regimes, as well as whether they're truly necessary or whether this exchange wants to interact with them, is something that I would think the privacy policy would really need to think through.
No, thank you for that feedback. That's right. I think in this context for advertising, we're not talking about PHI, right? We're not talking about protected health information or anything that would be covered under HIPAA, which I don't think works that well. But anyway, I do think, though, that it's a really good point, right? If you're collecting it, there needs to be a very clear why, purpose specification. Someone pointed us to the IAB framework, which apparently has a pretty good approach to that. So looking at that, I think what I thought about, and the reason I didn't knock that out immediately, was the senior citizen living in Boca Raton who wants to see content related to different health-related issues. So it's not diagnosis, right? And we talked about the same thing with location. We're not talking about diagnosis. We're going to be up here more. Maybe it's like maternal health or senior citizen health, that kind of stuff, right? I think would be privacy protective. But it's a fair point to ask, though.
Right, because then it begs the question, why are you singling out health in the policy that you're setting up?
Oh, no, we're not singling out. This was just an example of what might be a no-go, right? What might be, so we were trying to say what attributes should not ever be collected.
Okay.
And so we're kind of picking apart those. And so if you have any, or if anybody else thinks of some that just absolutely shouldn't, PHI would definitely be one.
Okay.
Maybe financial information outside of the context of payment. There are different ways of doing it. I'm not sure if there's any clear, just nothing. You should not ever collect this.
Yeah, because I could think of a lot of things, and it really depends on. Then you're really getting to the preferences of the individual, which is where we started on. How do we individualize this for folks? Right. Because we've also argued that there is no such thing as sensitive versus non-sensitive data. And so, at a certain point, are we trying to think of things that people don't want collected, or are we trying to think of how, when it's collected, it can be used?
Both, right? I mean, this isn't going to be a part of a third-party ecosystem in the sense that it is now. So I feel a little safer asking for some general type of information like that, because there won't be the same types of inferences that would be able to be made. There's no data being appended, right? So,
say something.
I think a lot of it's a discussion around the advertisers, what do they care about, right? And then starting there, then we know what they care about. They're going to be the ones really ultimately benefiting from this as well as us.
Right, so they can tell us what
So they can tell us
they
what's
want.
important, and we can go to and line them out and say, no, that's too sensitive. We can have, a
Right.
discussion from that point of view.
Yeah, it's really it's helpful to have that too. But yeah, I mean, at least this privacy policy is not going to be like, it's okay to get a bunch of personal stuff from people, right? It's just not.
That's a different thing than what he said.
No, what he was saying was finding out what the advertisers are interested in.
I guarantee you advertisers want personal information.
Sure, right. And so then we just say, no, 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 no. Right, I think what he was saying was, let's get a sense of that, because I don't really know either. What are advertisers going to say they want? But in this kind of ecosystem, I don't really know. So learning that. But.
Absolutely. They work on concepts of big data. I mean, they want as much information on you as possible. We might be working off of different definitions of personal information.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Security number and address and phone number.
Right, but we would probably include like IP address and stuff.
Yeah, those legal issues. The only reason why they need that.
I mean, whether I'm gay or straight is personal to me.
Oh, yeah.
They definitely want that information because that puts you in a bucket.
I would not be comfortable asking that of some ever.
Whether you have children.
So is that, I guess
What religion are you? Yeah.
a segment, your social security number is just your social security number. So I guess we're defining, what do we mean by personal data?
That's what I'm saying. I think we're working off different definitions, which is a longer conversation.
So do you think, so we need to define that in this privacy policy?
Perhaps.
Okay.
I took us down a real rabbit hole.
They may not know it factually, but they certainly know it by what you're buying and you're purchasing patterns, and that's what a lot of the advertisers are interested in. But I agree, there is a line what we're gonna collect and do things with.
I mean, just from an educational standpoint, at some point, people should be aware of what information is out there on their phone number and their physical address, and it's pretty shocking. Like what's already out there on the direct mail side that's existed for 50 years, nothing new. It's been around for a long time.
We're not going to add to that database. Okay, thanks for your feedback though, Chris.
We should move on.
Yeah, I think, so is that all of them?
Was there an ad fraud group? No.
No, because they moved in. All right, that was excellent. Thank you all again. At least my experience in that small group was reinforcing as to how much we need your help to really add the weight of your experience to what we come up with here. So to the extent that you can, before you leave today, determine maybe one person who's going to email you all and say, let's do a call. To just talk about this again and come up with something. That's really appreciated, and I'll reach out to you all to give you a friendly nudge to do that. So I know the next step we were going to have Chris and Elizabeth talk to us a little bit about the regulatory environment. I know we're closing in on time, so to the extent that you want to offer some stuff, some insight that we didn't already talk about, I guess that would be really great.
Well, and also we have to pick up a little time because Elizabeth busted her knee a couple of days ago, and so she did not join. She hasn't joined us. She's in Washington. Not busted. She just twisted it badly. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Go ahead.
I mean, we talked about this earlier over lunch, so I don't know how much I'm going to add to it, but maybe I'll just sort of underscore a couple of things that I'm seeing. So essentially what's driving federal privacy or consumer privacy legislation discussion in DC is the fact that GDPR is in Europe and the Privacy Shield is potentially in danger. At the same time, you've got California just passing the CCPA, and I expect a bunch more states are going to pass similar laws here in the very near future, this year. So you're going to have potentially what industry is concerned about is having a patchwork of patchwork of privacy legislation across the U.S. Now, that same dynamic has played out with data breach notification legislation, and everybody thought, oh, this is why we're going to have data breach legislation at the federal level, and that's been going on for like 6 or 7 years now. And there's all kinds of little internal industry debates about who's going to be liable for what and when should notification happen and all that sort of thing. So lots of reasons why the debate about consumer privacy legislation could get bogged down too. I think the debate, though, is maturing. If you remember the Zuckerberg hearing from last year, and it was generally, Congress was generally viewed as sort of uneducated about tech. The Google hearing the end of last year was a little better, and I think Congress will do more hearings here in the near future, and those will be a little better. And that probably plays out the same way that it has in the UK with Parliament. The hearings that they've held, they've gotten better and better and better and smarter and smarter and smarter. So I expect the privacy debate, even if they don't pass legislation, will get more educated, smarter, more focused. You've got a few bills that have been introduced, and I don't know that I take any of them that seriously at this point. They're really more sort of markers for what sort of where folks want to sort of plant their flag on the spectrum and have certain sort of issues at play. One thing I'm watching closely is Senator Wicker, Moran, Blumenthal, Schatz, and Thune. Those 5 are reportedly working on some sort of bipartisan consumer privacy bill that we could see here in the near future. So what I tell everyone, I've told our members, what I've told our board is, and like what I think you were saying at lunch, is that the prospects for passing consumer privacy legislation at the federal level this year are low. I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. The Founding Fathers developed a legislative process that doesn't lend itself to easy passage of bills, but you've also got a Democrat majority emboldened in the House, ready to fire off 1 million subpoenas to the Trump administration. And those same members of Congress, those same staffers that are working on those investigations are going to have to pivot and work with their Republican friends across the aisle. And so that's a tall order. And this legislative year's short, right? If it's not moving by June, it's probably not going to go anywhere because you're going to, the presidential cycle's already started, but you're going to have it really kick in the summer. And at that point, the parties diverge and they want to differentiate. They're not interested in compromising. So lots of reasons why it couldn't happen, but you never know. The Wicker, Moran, Thune, Schatz, Blumenthal bill could emerge in the next couple of weeks. The shutdown could end. They could sing Kumbaya and pass privacy legislation. So that's kind of the ladle.
That we're going to have another in-person in April. That's the plan right now, and we think it's going to be in Washington, D.C. We'll send out information about that as well as notes from yesterday and today's meetings. And, you know, I can't tell you how much we appreciate this. When I look over the notes, it may not feel like it. I hope it does to you, but we got a lot accomplished here. We fleshed out a lot of things. We debated a lot of issues that really needed to be debated. So if you have an issue, by the way, with being included on an email, please do let Bill, Joellen, myself know, and we will not put you on that email with the notes and everything else. And I you know, we're privacy folks here. Yes. So so thanks again. Do you want to do the go around? Okay.
Yeah, I just thought we had a really intensive day and a half. And something I often like to do when I've been in a group that's had a really intensive time is just go around and say one word about how you're feeling or what you're leaving with. It's just one word. It's whatever comes to the top of your mind. It can be tired. That's fine. It can be, you know, but whatever's going on with you. And let's just go around quickly. And you can pass if you don't want to do the exercise. But I find it's often really, really great. Bill, do you want to start us off?
No.
Do we have to pass
I guess I'm feeling that we are doing a good job of supporting each other's ideas.
Okay, supportive.
Yep.
Great. Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's consensus around the need for a different economic framework than what we have right now. And I think there's growing clarity around what would be the components technically, economically, policy-wise to do that. And I'm not going to bother with the mic, so I apologize to all the non-viewers.
So, so you can just do one word, so like consensus.
I think definitions, we need more definitions. It's that we understand the components of who matters, users, advertisers, publishers. There's a lot of definitions we need to learn. Enthused.
I'm optimistic.
Oh, wow, that's a big one.
Intricate, and I think this helped me kind of conceptualize what we're doing, but I think there's a lot more drilling down that needs to be done to make a lot of progress.
Enlightened-ish.
Ambitious. Less confused.
Cautiously optimistic.
Digesting. Divided. I feel like we're talking about two different goals and we're trying to put them together and it's hard.
Cautious-ish.
Hopeful.
I feel like we're at the beginning. There's still a lot to do at the beginning. Hopeful. Surprise. Perspectives.
Wait. By what? You have to
No,
say by what?
no,
Okay.
one word.
Perspectives that bring back to
We'll see.
stuffed and smothered.
Thankful.
Informed.
I'm still curious about, I don't understand the business model, how it would be disrupted for things as tech piece. And it seems like that's a lot of moving parts, and I'd like to understand it better.
Informed. Grateful.
Excited. I like hard problems.
Fred?
Impressed with the brain trust in this room.
Well, with that, goodbye, and we'll see you hopefully in the spring.
Yep. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.